In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 3, in which we now turn our attention to product supply, where in terms of our last video, we revisited the consumer problem in order to look at product demand, in which we saw there's an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of a good, from which we distinguish between changes in quantity demanded from changes in demand, where we saw that changes in quantity demanded is movement along the product demand curve due to a change in the price of that particular good or service. This contrasted from changes in demand, which were left or rightward shifts of the entire product demand curve due to a change in a non-price determinant of product demand. With respect to today, we seek to do the same but with product supply. So this will require us to revisit our firm problem in order to define product supply and look at its underlying properties, from which we will conclude by distinguishing between movements versus shifts with respect to the product supply curve. So to begin, let us revisit the firm problem, in which our setup for firms is that firms want to make themselves the best off possible given how well they transform resources into goods, where firms will supply goods and services to the product market, and they will demand factors of production such as labor and capital in the factor markets, where with respect to this chapter, we will focus on product supply for firms. And in terms of the firm problem, we formally stated this as firms maximize profits subject to the production constraints, which we can alternatively express as firms want to make the most amount of money possible given how well they can produce goods and services with their limited amounts of factors of production such as labor and capital, where the solution to this firm problem is going to give us product supply, where we can formally define product supply as the ability and willingness to sell and produce specific quantities of a good at alternative prices in a given time period, holding all else constant, or ceteris paribus, where the intuition behind product supply is that firms make a comparison much like consumers did with respect to product demand, where consumers compared additional satisfaction to the price of a good. Firms will compare additional revenue from producing more of a good or service to additional costs from producing more of a good or service, where revenue is going to be money flowing into a company and costs are going to be money flowing out of a company, where the difference between revenue and costs is going to give us profits. And in terms of this comparison that the firm does, in terms of comparing additional money flowing in versus additional money flowing out, it will be influenced by factors such as technology in terms of how well a firm can use advances in technology to produce goods and services, factor costs in terms of how much does it cost to use a unit of labor and capital to produce a good or service, the price of other goods in that particular firm's portfolio of goods and services that they produce, costs incurred by paying taxes to the government or a reduction in costs that the firm incurs due to the government helping them with subsidies, how a firm perceives the price of their good to be in the future, affecting their decisions today, and lastly, with the quantity of sellers in a particular product market. Now, with respect to product supply, a key feature will be that it is upward sloping due to a positive relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied of a good. This positive relationship between price and quantity supplied, we can iterate via the law of supply, which states that the quantity of a good supplied in a given time period increases as its price increases, given no other changes, where we can give two arguments in terms of supporting the law of supply, where the first argument is going to be that as the price of a good increases, there is additional incentive for the firm to produce more of a good or service, in that they can generate a higher income stream in the form of revenue, which could correspond to potentially more profits so long as that higher revenue stream exceeds additional costs incurred by producing more goods and services. And the additional argument is that if a firm decides to produce more of a good or service, to produce more of a good or service means to use more factors of production such as labor or capital, which means higher costs. So to be able to cover producing more of a good or service and cover those costs, a firm has incentive to increase the price point to be able to cover those costs. Now, graphically, we can represent product supply via the supply curve, which we have below, where on the vertical axis we have the price of a particular good or service, and on the horizontal axis we have quantity of a particular good or service. This red upward sloping curve represents product supply, where at each point we have a particular quantity supplied and price point at which a firm is willing and able to produce and sell a particular good or service, where we observe from points A to B, B to C, and C to D, as the price of the good increases, the quantity supplied of the good increases as well, which follows the law of supply in that there's a positive relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied of a good. Now, with some intuition on product supply as it being the solution to the firm problem, and that there is a positive relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied of a good, yielding a positively sloped graphical representation, let us now distinguish between movements along the product supply curve versus shifts of the product supply curve. Beginning with movements of the product supply curve, this will stem from changes in quantity supplied, which will be movements along the supply curve due to a change in the price of that good. Where, with respect to movement along the product supply curve, should the price of a good increase, this would then correspond to upward movement along the product supply curve, corresponding to an increase in quantity supplied, whereas on the other hand, if the price of a particular good decreases, this would then correspond to downward movement along the product supply curve, corresponding to decreases in quantity supplied for a particular good or service. To look at the price increase case, here we have our graphical representation of product supply once again, where on the vertical axis we have price, and on the horizontal axis we have quantity. We have our upward sloping product supply curve in red, and beginning at point A, if a firm decides to increase the price of its particular good or service, with an increase in price, this then corresponds to upward movement along the product supply curve, corresponding to an increase in quantity supplied, which we see via point B. Should this firm continue to increase its price, with an increase in price, we have further upward movement along the product supply curve, yielding us an increase in quantity supplied, as we see with point C. And lastly, should the firm decide to increase its price once more, we'll have further increases in quantity supplied due to further upward movement along the product supply curve. Now, with some intuition on movements along the product supply curve due to changes in price, let us now look at shifts in the product supply curve. Shifts in the product supply curve will come from changes in supply, which we can define as a shift in the supply curve due to a non-price determinant of supply changing, where with respect to our non-price determinants, we've mentioned that these non-price determinants include technology, factor costs, the price of other goods in that firm's portfolio, expectations of the price of their good in the future affecting their decisions today, taxes that the firm has to pay to the government, subsidies lowering the cost that a firm has to pay due to the government helping them out, and the quantity of firms in a particular product market, where with respect to the magnitude of a particular determinant changing and how it affects the supply curve in terms of a rightward or leftward shift, this is detailed in the table below. And in terms of working through some examples, we will do so in the following slides by considering a rightward and a leftward shift in the product supply curve. So, beginning with a rightward shift in the product supply curve, suppose that we have a firm that has an increase in technology due to some advancements in terms of how they produce goods and services. If we start with our initial product supply curve, which we have our graphical representation here, where on the vertical axis we have price, and on the horizontal axis we have quantity. We have our initial upward sloping product supply curve in red, product supply 0, and we're holding price constant. Should there be an improvement in technology, this firm will be able to produce more of a good or service using the same amount of factors of production as they could before. So this would then correspond to a rightward shift in the product supply curve, which we see with this new green upward sloping curve, product supply 1, such that holding price constant, we see that there's an increase in quantity supplied due to this improvement in technology, due to this rightward shift in the product supply curve as well. Now, turning our attention to a leftward shift in the product supply curve, let us consider the case in which there is an increase in taxes. So here we have our graphical representation once more, in which we have price on the vertical axis and we have quantity of a good or service on the horizontal axis. We begin with our initial upward sloping product supply curve in red, product supply 0, and we start at point A and we're going to assume that price is held constant. If this firm faces an increase in taxes, they incur higher costs in that they have to pay more money to the government. With an increase in costs, this means that this firm can produce less of a good or service due to the costs that they face, such that there is a leftward shift in the product supply curve, as we see with this green upward sloping curve, product supply 1, such that holding price constant with an increase in taxes corresponding to increased costs that this firm incurs, this leftward shift would correspond to a reduction in quantity supplied compared to our original product supply curve. So, with some intuition on product supply as the solution to the firm problem, and that there's a positive relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied of a good, and being able to distinguish between movements along the product supply curve versus left and rightward shifts of the product supply curve, where we will pick up in our next video is by putting our twin forces of product demand and product supply together in order to examine a market, define the concept of market equilibrium, and see how shifts in the product demand and product supply curve can also correspond to changes in equilibrium.